In the early fall of 1944, the Japanese recognized that the United States would soon unleash a new offensive in the Pacific, with the Philippines being the most likely objective. In preparation for the coming assault, the Japanese Army and Navy had already based several thousand planes throughout the Philippines, but finding men capable of flying them was another matter.
The Japanese had oriented their aircrew training towards one objective, and that was creating a very small elite cadre of highly trained personnel who could inflict tremendous offensive damage on a foe. Well, this was a very, very sharp blade, but it was also very thin, because once these original pilots were lost in the battles in 1942 and 43, there was nothing coming from the training commands back in Japan to replace these guys. The pilots that were being thrown into those fights, especially in the Solomons in 1943, were much lesser experienced. They didn't have the training that the earlier cadres did. And because the Zero was so easily destroyed in air-to-air combat, these new Japanese pilots didn't have the chance to come up their learning curve in combat and become experienced fighter pilots. And while they did expand their training regimen and training program, they were unable to produce the quality of pilots necessary to hold the line against the swelling strength of the American air services.
The disparity in the quality of men and machines available to the opposing air arms had been proven emphatically the previous June during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an air-sea battle that cost the Japanese 3 carriers and nearly 400 aircraft.
We hadn't fought a fleet battle carrier to carrier since Midway, and that gave us a chance to really build up our might out there, and a lot of us pack in the hours, get in a lot of good training, and a lot of pilots, just aching for a fight.
Though the Americans got their fight, it wasn't much of a contest. The clash was so one-sided that the pilots involved nicknamed it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. After the battle, Japan's aircraft carrier force was no longer militarily effective, and many senior Japanese leaders began to doubt that traditional air power alone could stop the Americans. Something more was needed.
Faced with overwhelming American air superiority, it was the Japanese Army Air Corps that came up with the first ideas for new tactics. At the island of Biak in the summer of 1944, north of New Guinea, small groups of planes were sent to deliberately crash into American naval vessels. In October, Admiral Takajiro Onishi proposed setting up a special attack corps with volunteer pilots from his own units who would follow the Army's example and carry out crash dives into American warships.
By organizing the Kamikaze Tokotai, the Japanese sought to attack the Americans psychologically and make them lose their will to continue the war. Onishi's plan was quickly adopted, and in the Philippines, the Special Attack Corps was hastily organized even as American troops and General MacArthur splashed ashore at Leyte, triggering the greatest naval battle in history, the Battle for Leyte Gulf.
The Japanese decided they would stake all once the Americans invaded the Philippines. So it was here they were going to try to fight their last-ditch decisive battle. And the only remaining assets the Japanese Navy had left were its huge battleships. What they wanted to do was get those fleet assets, get those battleships in amongst the American transports, and destroy the American fleet invading Leyte Island. Well, the only way that was going to be successful was if the American carriers weren't in the area and had been diverted or distracted away from the Leyte landing sites. There weren't any planes hardly left to the Japanese carriers at this point, so the flat tops themselves were useless assets. So what they decided to do was use the remaining fleet carriers as bait to draw the American aircraft carrier forces away from Leyte and give the Japanese battleships a chance to get in amongst the transports.
Halsey took the bait and steamed off after the Japanese carriers, leaving behind a small group of escort carriers and destroyers to cover the Leyte landings.
This Japanese battle fleet comes down through those back island and catches these little jeep carriers in there, and heck, they haven't got the speed or the armament. The only armament they have is what few little airplanes they have on them,
Here we were with 12 FM2s and 8 or TBMs, and these little jeeps at top speed with about 17 knots, facing one of the world's largest battleships with 18-inch guns on her, and shells started hitting all around us. And our sister ship was a Gambier Bay, which was sunk later by shell fire, and incidentally is the only carrier sunk by surface ship during the war.
In one of the great examples of sheer guts in naval history, the outgunned Americans fought so tenaciously that the Japanese surface fleet managed to sink only the Gambier Bay before they gave up and turned for home. But then the kamikazes struck. The Americans, weakened by combat losses in the earlier engagement, were unable to put up much in the way of defense. The escort carriers Santee, Suwannee, and Callanan Bay all took direct hits but were not damaged heavily. The San Lo was not so fortunate. Struck by a single kamikaze that crashed through her flight deck, she was engulfed in a huge ball of flame. Powerful internal explosions followed, and about 15 minutes later, San Lo slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. In the days that followed, several other carriers were hit as well, including the fleet carrier USS Lexington.
I was up on the flight deck the day we got the kamikaze hit, and I could see these two planes coming in, and our gunners finally shot one down, just disintegrated. But the other guy kept coming, and here I was, standing up there gawking. And I finally realized, he's going to hit. So I took off for the hangar deck. And about the time I got about halfway down, he hit in the island structure. He did a lot of damage. I don't know. There was maybe 100 and some odd people got killed, and several burned badly and wounded badly. But it was pretty tough. It strained the resources on board ship to take care of all the wounded and the dead and clean up. We didn't cease operations except for just a few hours. We were operational again the next day.
More attacks off Leyte soon followed.
There were about 50 Japanese planes that came over the hills from the west of Leyte. And the Japanese started down toward the shipping area, and the Navy then latched onto them, I say the Navy fighter pilots. And I had a spectacular view of aerial combat there in the fact that I saw 5 Japanese planes going down in flame at one time. And really there was only one plane, Japanese plane, that got out over the shipping area. And by the time he got there, he was smoking and flaming, and he kamikazed into the ship right behind us and crashed and burned. And I do not know whether that ship sunk or not, but it took a lot of damage.
But everybody was shooting out there, and that could make you nervous because you get shrapnel falling on the deck. It was like rain. You hear it thinking, and some of those guys would shoot at a plane and follow it down, and the bullets would be zipping over your head. That's kind of interesting. And they had 2 try to hit our tender, and I was on there trying to change an engine on a boat alongside of it. And this plane come down, and 5 inches of the tender was going, and the machine guns and everything shooting. And this plane came down, and they missed us, and it came down right alongside of the PT boat. His wing clipped the crane we was working with, and he crashed outside. There was a big explosion and cloud of smoke. And then another one crashed astern. They had a suicide plane. Both of them missed the tender. If they had hit it, well, I guess I wouldn't be here now.
As the Philippines campaign wore on, the increasingly desperate Japanese scored some deadly successes with their kamikazes. Though carriers and battleships always drew the most attention, no ship, regardless of size, was immune from attack.
I guess it was a Zero that was making a run on us, and of course they knew when I saw him coming that he was set up for a suicide hit on the boat. The skipper was at the wheel of the boat, and I think that he had just started to turn the boat to maneuver out of the path of the plane, but he didn't get the boat moved before it hit. The effect that it had on the bow of the boat was like a catapult. The gun loader and myself, and also the gunner on the 20 millimeter, were all catapulted up in the air. I'm not sure how high in the air that it went, but it was far enough that I had time to look down and see the wreckage of the boat. And my concern was whether I was going to land in the water or hit on some of the wreckage, but I missed the wreckage.
These new Japanese attacks shocked the Americans, who sought ways to counter this new threat. And the U.S. Navy worked quickly to beef up its fleet defenses. First, more anti-aircraft guns were mounted on every ship, from the lowliest landing craft to the mightiest battleship. But in most cases, these light cannon and machine guns could serve only as last-ditch point defense weapons. The Navy needed a way to keep the kamikazes from ever getting to their targets in the first place. What the fleet needed were more fighters. To make that happen, the carrier air groups were reorganized in the late fall of 1944. The bomber squadrons were reduced in size, while the number of fighters was almost doubled.
Because of all the kamikazes, they had displaced a lot of the torpedo planes and bombers and made 72 plane fighter squadrons. About half the planes on board ship were going to be fighters. So we had a 72 plane squadron and 102 or 3 pilots.
By late in the war, squadrons of SB-2Cs and of TBM Avengers had dwindled to barely 12 to 15 aircraft in some instances because of the kamikaze threat and because of the Hellcat being able to do so much as far as not only air-to-air but air-to-ground. They bulked up the number of fighters.
With the need for more fighters to combat the kamikazes so severe, the Navy grabbed Marine Corsair squadrons and assigned them to shipboard duty.
Corsairs were initially introduced to combat in the Solomon Islands on land. They did not fly from carriers initially and operated with the Marine Corps and also one famous Navy squadron, the Jolly Rogers of Fighting Squadron 17. Later in the war, the aircraft did make it aboard carrier decks. And really it did that because they needed extra fighters on board that could handle the kamikazes and combat the kamikazes.
The hope was that with increased combat air patrols, more fighters available for intercept missions, and more fighter pilots available, the Navy could throw a big blue blanket over its fleet, protecting the precious ships below from further attacks.
The whole concept behind the big blue blanket was the Navy wanted the ability to keep enough fighters up over the fleet to be able to handle any incoming attacks. Kamikaze or conventional attacks didn't matter. They wanted hundreds of fighters to be available to protect the fleet from these new Japanese threats.
Even as the U.S. Navy reorganized to face the kamikaze threat, the Japanese were preparing for the last-ditch defense of the home islands. Thousands of pilots had either volunteered or been conscripted into the Kamikaze Corps, and during the early months of 1945, the Japanese greatly expanded the Special Attack Force. Although some units included experienced flyers, the average kamikaze pilot received little in the way of training.
You didn't have to be an excellent flyer to be a kamikaze pilot. All you had to do was fly the thing into a fixed target, and that's what did us in the kamikaze attacks.
While the Japanese held the bulk of its kamikaze force back in the home islands, a few night raids were launched against the American fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Central Pacific. One such attack in March 1945 did considerable damage to the fleet carrier USS Randolph.
It was just about dark, just dusk, and all of a sudden there was this incredible explosion. And I came up on the flight deck, and the whole aft end of the ship back there was nothing but flames and black smoke. The flight deck was all ruptured and pushed up. Then I went on down to the hangar deck, and the whole aft end of the hangar deck was still burning, and there were several casualties, so it was pretty gruesome. But anyway, I went up on the forecastle front end of the ship, got as far away from the fire and stuff as possible. But the ship's damage control people had the fire out in less than a half an hour.
The full weight of the Special Attack Corps was finally unleashed against the American fleet in April 1945 in what the Japanese called hikusui, or floating chrysanthemum attacks. Waves of kamikazes took off in search of the American carriers. The U.S. Navy was ready and waiting for them. But even so, the hundreds of kamikazes that attacked simultaneously overwhelmed the fleet's air defenses.
The Japanese air raids really didn't start in earnest until about 5 days before the invasion of Okinawa. And we'd been there a couple of days and saw sporadic air action from the Japanese, but on the 26th and 27th of March, there was big raids and a lot of damaged ships from mainly kamikaze planes. And then on the 28th and 29th, our ship shot down 6 kamikaze planes and 2 fighter planes, 2 attack bombers, and 1 twin-engine bomber.
And I look up, and it's a Japanese kamikaze. And I'm realizing this fool's getting ready to come down either my stack or that guy over there in that other vessel. So I watched him to see where he was going, and fortunately for me, he did in fact go down the stack of that other ship.
Dozens of ships took hits, despite the huge number of American fighters patrolling over the fleet.
Kamikazes were usually in such small groups that they didn't show up on the ship's radar till the last minute, which really meant, though, if you were on combat air patrol, then you got sort of a last-minute vector to intercept the incoming raid.
I don't remember any different mindset. You know, a Japanese plane was a Japanese plane, and we tried to get them all. And it doesn't happen the way you think. Well, it may with some fighter aces, but I got so excited. You're supposed to go in and they tell you, you shoot a little burst of ammunition and then you change your aim to correct it, and you have some tracers going out there so you can correct the aim. And then you correct your aim and shoot another burst. Listen, I was there like I had a garden hose. Man, I had my finger on that trigger, and I wasn't going to let him go.
And when you'd hit them, they would just explode all over the place because they had all this TNT in them.
Though the Combat Air Patrol shot down countless would-be kamikazes, hundreds managed to survive long enough to mount an attack on an enemy vessel. Especially hard hit were the picket destroyers sent north of Okinawa to act as early warning radar ships. They attracted kamikazes almost every day, making their duty one of the most dangerous in U.S. Navy history.
Picket stations were ordinarily manned by a destroyer or 2 destroyers and several LCI types. There was another version of the LCI called the LCS, which was built from the beginning as a fire support vessel. You didn't have to convert troop compartments to magazines or that sort of thing because they were made for this purpose in the beginning. And they had 3 dual 40s, which made it quite an effective anti-aircraft platform for a small vessel. And they would assign 3 or 4 of those, or LCIGs or Ms, with the destroyers out on those stations. And the suicide planes would always go for the destroyers because they go for the bigger ships.
Within about 10 minutes' time, we had 3 planes diving at us, and every one of them missed us. They missed us close enough that when their bombs exploded to our some holes in our ship, but it wasn't anything serious. It didn't affect our ship that much. We were able to patch that up and be on our way again. But yeah, I saw quite a number of ships go down from Jap suicide planes. Some of them were very fortunate. Some of them didn't lose too many lives. Some of them sunk very fast. Some of them had maybe a half an hour before they sunk, and most of the survivors were able to get off,
One of the really important things about the LCI types being out there, the LCSs or the LCIs, was to rescue guys off the ships.
About 3 months, almost 4 months of real hell. And I say hell because you never knew these planes were coming in. They were coming in by the dozens,
If they come straight at you, they're not hard to shoot down. You have time to line up on them, and they're coming in like a duck coming right in at you. But if they're going sideways or across, you have to lead them like leading a duck, and that's not as easy. Well, this Betty we shot down, but it had released what they call a Baka bomb, a winged bomb with a pilot inside that had rocket propulsion as well. And this thing came shooting down at us, and we didn't know what it was, and we managed to shoot it down at the last minute. It landed about 70 yards from us. And then another Betty released another Baka bomb, and this one came down, and we had time to line up both 5-inch guns and 40 millimeters, and we were shooting at this thing, and shot the wings off, and then the fuselage, where the pilot was, the warhead in the nose separated from the rest of the fuselage, and it sounds impossible, but anyway, the warhead skipped on the water and skipped over our fantail and exploded on the other side. It was just by the grace of God that we weren't hit by the thing.
During one 2-day period, the Japanese sent 350 kamikazes against the American fleet. Almost all were shot down, but a few did get through to do extensive damage to 19 ships, including the Pearl Harbor veteran battleship USS Nevada.
And it hit the side of the number 3 turret and blew up. And it blew the quarterdeck down right to the top of the table in the chief's quarters. And there were 45 injured, and there were 11 killed.
You could look out over the bay there where we'd landed the ship, and we could see those kamikazes coming in, and the amount of bullets we put up there, and they'd somehow managed to fly through that. And you'd only seeing every third bullet, the tracers, you realize that there's that many, 3 times that more going up there. How could they fly through it? Well, they didn't always, but they did some. They got through there. And we had a grandstand seat, you might say.
In the days and weeks that followed the landing at Okinawa, kamikazes struck numerous capital ships, including the battleship New Mexico and the fleet carriers Enterprise and Hancock.
When our Hancock was kamikaze, I was out on an attack, but when I came back, we had to circle until they put a makeshift area for a deck, which is about a third as big as what the normal landing area was ordinarily. Some of the guys ran out of fuel because of the delay, and I landed, and I remember they took the plane immediately down, and when they looked there was a guy laying over his 40 millimeter guns with all of his clothing blown off, and he was laying there dead, and there were guys blown up against the bulkheads with nothing on their clothes left, just blood, and it's just not a very pretty picture.
In spite of the terrible damage inflicted upon the American fleet off Okinawa, withdrawal was not an option. The support of operations onshore demanded continued fleet support. In this amazing sequence, a Japanese Zero begins a run on the battleship Missouri, operating off Okinawa on the 11th of April, 1945. The plane hit the ship's side below the main deck, but caused only minor damage when the bomb it was carrying failed to detonate. Miraculously, there were no casualties on board the Missouri, which steamed on as if nothing at all had happened. Most ships were not so fortunate. On May 11th, Admiral Mark Mitscher's flagship, the carrier Bunker Hill, was severely damaged by 2 kamikazes. The explosions that followed resulted in the deaths of 346 men.
It was just a loud bang, and then of course after that there were many other noises and explosions and roaring, but that was the first thing I heard. And I went up to our battle station at that time was in the wardroom, so I went up there and it was just chaos, smoke and stuff everywhere, because the kamikaze, the first one, the main one, hit right at the base of the island structure on the flight deck, right opposite, right in the middle of the dead center of the ship. And of course the ready rooms hang under the flight deck right there. And this guy went right through the torpedo squadron ready room and killed everybody that was in the ready room except for one guy.
To further combat the kamikazes, the fleet carriers moved north and struck at Japanese air bases in southern Kyushu.
We'd leave the Yorktown and fly low in the water, and when we approached Japan, we'd climb up a couple thousand feet and try to find our designated target, and we'd drop a couple bombs and climb up again. We were supposed to look and see if there were any kamikaze planes on the ground that we couldn't see from above, and so if we did see some planes, the next run we'd drop the other bombs on the planes that we might have seen in the airfield.
One of the airfields, I've forgotten the name of it, but I was making a run on it, found a big double revetment, just like a double U. It has 0 parts in either revetment. And I came down at about a 60-degree angle, and I fired 2 rockets, one off each wing. And about halfway down, these were 5-inch rockets, and they crossed, and one went into each revetment, destroyed 2 zeros just like that.
Hundreds of kamikaze planes were destroyed on the ground during these attacks, much to the relief of the sailors off Okinawa. By the time the Okinawa campaign ended in July 1945, the Japanese had expended some 5,000 kamikaze pilots and planes against the U.S. Navy. These attacks sank 36 ships, killed 4,900 American soldiers, and wounded another 4,800. Another 368 ships had been damaged.
When the war ended a month later, the Americans discovered that the Japanese had been hoarding aircraft, pilots, and gasoline in hidden places all over the islands, ready for an American invasion of Kyushu. Had the war continued, the American fleet would have faced a far greater threat from the kamikazes than it had off Okinawa.
Despite the incredible sacrifice and bravery of the Special Attack Corps, the kamikaze menace never threatened to defeat the Allied navies. The inexperience of the average kamikaze pilot helped set the table for eager Hellcat and Corsair pilots who shot these all but helpless men down in droves.
Really hazard was if you happen to be on the tail of a Japanese kamikaze and you followed it in to the ship where he was going, and you probably get shot down by our own fire, because it was so intense, and they couldn't. You just had to fly through it. So you were, they said if you want a Navy Cross, follow one in. You notice I didn't tell you I had the Navy Cross.
Out of the cloud came a Marine aviator in an F-4U Corsair, and it came down on the tail of this Japanese plane and shot it down just before it hit us. And of course, all of this, I was in the radar room, so I just saw pips, but on the screen, blips. But those on deck said the guy shot it down, and he pulled out of the dive and waved at us, and everybody waved back, and everybody thought, well, there goes our hero.
Anti-aircraft fire also claimed hundreds of kamikazes.
Generally, to keep out of the fire of the destroyers, they would come in right on the water. I'm talking about maybe 8 or 10 feet above the water. And when they got to the destroyer, they'd pull up real abruptly and hope that they didn't get hit with the destroyer's weapons, and then they would just swoop down into a carrier. Just do a big kind of a loop into them. But they had us pretty well worried, because those people didn't care about life. They would just dive, and they'd dive right into the carrier.
By 1945, the American fleet had so many air defense systems that it was probably the single most formidable target any aviator has ever had to attack. To pierce the fleet's anti-aircraft defenses, the kamikazes first had to run the gauntlet of rapid-fire, heavy 5-inch flak while still over a mile from their target. Those who survived that fusillade faced hundreds of 40-millimeter Bofors that could stud the sky with thousands of explosive shells. The few who survived to make their final attack runs encountered a storm of 20-millimeter and 50 caliber machine gun fire.
When the 5-inch guns went off, we knew that we were being attacked. They were shooting pretty well out. And then when the 40-millimeter started to go, you know that somebody's making a run on you. And then when the 20s went off and they're all going at the same time, then you know you're going to get it. That's when you start looking for a rivet to hide under or something, anything. It's hard to hide on a ship.
Those kamikazes lucky enough to penetrate the fighter screen and anti-aircraft guns often did not have the experience needed to guide their plane at high speeds into a ship. Consequently, there were many kamikazes that managed to survive the American Combat Air Patrol screen in anti-aircraft fire, only to crash uselessly into the ocean after overshooting their targeted ship.
These huge 40-millimeter traces started coming up, and right behind the traces came this zero. I guess his training was so minimal that he luckily couldn't even hit the carrier. But anyway, it exploded on the starboard side. Must have had a pretty good-sized bomb because it really gave the ship a big jolt.
Though only a small percentage of kamikazes managed to reach their targets, the nature of the attacks inspired dread amongst American sailors. Those that got through to hit a ship almost always inflicted tremendous damage and casualties, making them one of the most feared and destructive weapons the U.S. Navy faced during the Second World War.
It's exciting, frightening, and the results can be pretty horrible.
And when they hit you, you know. There's nothing you can do. You got to stop them before they hit you. And so you're just praying and hoping that you make it.
You wonder who's going to get lucky here. Are we going to knock this one or that next plane out of the air? Or is he going to knock us out of the water? It's an eternal gamble right there.
Japan's last desperate gamble ultimately failed, but the deliberate sacrifice of a relative few allowed a weak military power to threaten a far stronger opponent. It is an idea that has not been forgotten.
As the war wound down to its foreseeable conclusion, more and more Axis soldiers began to see the writing on the wall. Entire formations and individual stragglers made or fought their way towards the Elbe River and the chance to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Russians.
And after about a week, we came close to the Elbe River, and the American forces were already on the east side of the Elbe River. They were already crossing that river. And so one day, we came to that town, and there were the white flags they had out already everywhere, on the houses, and there came a couple of Americans in a motorcycle and a sidecar there, and they just stopped where we were. We had still our weapons, they had their weapons, and they didn't, we knew that the war was over.
As the Wehrmacht came in to lay down its arms, the Allies were
Germany was partitioned in 4 sectors: the Russian sector, American sector, British sector, and the French sector. And that part east of the Elbe River was being turned over to the Russians. And we were there, and so they had to take us out of there.
In the Pacific theater, this problem was compounded by 3 other factors. First, the dropping of the atomic bomb had brought a rapid and somewhat unexpected end to the war. Second, where colonial governments had been replaced by the Japanese, there was no government or infrastructure remaining to fall back on. Lastly, the sheer area involved and the numbers of Japanese left behind in isolated areas by the island-hopping strategy was immense. Throughout the world, as people were liberated from the chains of oppression, their rage was often directed at those who had cooperated with the oppressors. Collaborators suffered a variety of fates at the hands of recently freed people as revenge was extracted for the brutal years of occupation. Finally, there was the problem of repatriating the large numbers of Axis POWs that had been captured earlier and moved to camps in America. Slowly, the former enemy returned to their homes and to the task of rebuilding their shattered countries.
So it was just 2 days before Christmas in 1945 when I was able to go home.
Millions of prisoners in concentration camps became as Allied forces squeezed the Nazi army back, the appalling truth came out. Generals like George Patton forced the nearby residents to see the horror they had ignored.
In the first place, if we hadn't won the war, it would have meant that the Japanese and the Germans, particularly the Germans, would have won it. And I just think you could imagine what kind of a world that would have been.
Refugees fleeing the onrushing armies, east or west, or escaping Nazi tyranny. The plight of the millions of displaced persons in Europe shortly after the end of the war was tragic. Housed and nourished, spirits are harder to care for, but could be raised with the dawning of the occupying Allied powers in various capacities rather than return to their occupied homelands, remaining in West Germany through the fall of the Iron Curtain and even beyond. When Berlin fell to the combined Allied forces, Hitler killed himself. His associates, in uniform and out, were providing a quick bullet to the head. It was faster than a trial. But psychosis is seldom obvious, whether it involves that harmless neighbor down the street, a beloved relative, or an entire nation. Millions of prisoners in concentration camps became unwilling cogs in the war machine, worked to death in subterranean rocket assembly plants and munitions. As Allied forces squeezed the Nazi army back, the appalling truth came out. Generals like George Patton forced the nearby residents to see the horror they had ignored.
In the first place, if we hadn't won the war, would have meant that the Japanese and the Germans, particularly the Germans, would have won it. And I just think you could imagine what kind of a world that would have been.
Refugees fleeing the onrushing armies, east or west, or escaping Nazi tyranny. The plight of the millions of displaced persons in Europe shortly after the end of the war was tragic. Housed and nourished, spirits are harder to care for, but could be raised with the dawning of hope for a better future. But the camps are only temporary solutions. As rapidly as they could, the Allies processed and moved the displaced persons home or to a new home. They were interviewed and processed and moved throughout. These people went to work for the occupying Allied powers in various capacities rather than return to their occupied homelands, remaining in West Germany through the fall of the Iron Curtain and even beyond. When Berlin fell to the combined Allied forces, Hitler killed himself. His associates, in uniform and out, it was faster than a trial. But psychosis is seldom obvious, whether it involves that harmless neighbor down the street, a beloved relative, or an entire nation.